Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is Sunday, February 12th. So happy Sunday to everyone. We celebrated the Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes, which is a special celebration for us because we attend Our Lady of Lourdes Parish here in North Carolina. So a happy Sunday to everyone. I wish I could say that things in the news looked happy, but it's just so wacky right now with this train derailment in Ohio and this wacky unidentified objects being shot down by our Air Force. It's just things sometimes seem so bizarre in the political sphere. I'm just thankful that as a Christian, I know that everything is fine. So don't allow yourself to be too distracted by this stuff, but stay focused because, Jesus told us, I have overcome the world. And all of these crazy distractions, we don't know the nature or origin of them, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories and arguments and political agendas and things, and it's impossible for us to sort these things out. So keep your head straight and stay focused on the things that are in your control, your own daily duties and responsibilities, and find peace in those things. Today, I was asked by a friend this week if I would take some time to talk about all of this transgender stuff, because some of this stuff is starting to creep into our families. We're starting to have some direct interaction with it. Questions about gender, questions about sexuality, these things, they're common through all of the media and through all of our society. It's impossible not to come into contact with it in some way, and it has an influence on kids everywhere. And I was asked if I would take some time to talk about it because one friend of ours in particular said they had a daughter going through this sort of identifying as a non-binary, such and such, and they were just hoping that we could think through it and sort of gain some perspective as to how we should approach it, what we should think about, and so on. Now, the problem with these political issues in modern society is when we're in this two-party system, you immediately have this two-party response, these two extremes of political views, both of which are ignorant and reckless. You've got this far-right conservative response, which is going to say one thing, then you've got this far-left response that's going to say another thing, and these two extremes are just quickest to the media outlets, and they dominate the public discourse, and that's just what we've come to take as normal in American life. And so from the conservative side, when we hear this talk about someone identifying as non-binary, they're not male or female, but they have this other gender identity that they talk about, and we get into all of this bizarre talk because most of us who think it's bizarre don't think like that. But there's this far right response which says, baloney, there's two genders, male and female. Men do this, women do this, and that's the way it is, and anyone who says anything other than that is just an enemy of nature and a destroyer of everything good. And that message gets, fired from the far right, and then we've got the extreme left, which, is encouraging people to identify as animals and who knows what. It's just the wackiness, on both sides. Just it provides nothing but entertainment. There's no wisdom or truth in it. And so what I'd like to do is to get into a little more of the subtleties of this issue, because I think there's some good in it. I think there's actually something that's being revealed by these issues that's good for us as Catholics to think about and talk about. And let's realize that the context of this discussion, the sort of a simultaneous phenomenon in Catholic circles is that there's no interest in religious vocations. There's relatively. I know we can all name one or two or some that we've known who have become a monk or a nun or a priest. But I'm saying, if we think about the population of Catholics in our countries and then compare that to the number of people showing any interest in religious vocations, it's statistically zero. There's relatively no interest in religious vocations. And so we've got these phenomena taking place at the same time, and I certainly think that they're related. And that's why I think that this whole gender dysphoria situation is actually an interesting one, because it may be revealing some problems that have some common origins and are worth pursuing. And I understand that parents asking about this, they're primarily concerned with what's going on with their kids and what should they do about it. So I'll try to be practical as well. But here's what I would like to talk about and what's been on my mind as I've thought about this situation. Since the Protestant Reformation, Protestantism, which has sort of dominated the public sphere in America from the time of the founding of the public schools and the founding fathers, more or less being Protestant-ish religiously and things like that. America has had this Protestant worldview, and this has been spread through America. And of course, it's false. It's a false worldview, and while we may think it's relatively innocent because, well, at least they believe in God, they're not atheists, they're not evolutionists, and we've identified all of these, boogeyman enemies of the Christian life, and we consider Protestants to be good because they may be pro-life or they may be anti-evolution in these different ideas. But the reality is Protestantism is false. It's heretical and false teaching. It's been condemned by the church. And so we can't expect that there's going to be good outcomes of false ideas. And one of the principal errors of Protestantism has to do with gender. And I think that this is one of the origins or causes of the craziness that we're seeing unfold in sort of post-Protestant America. We like to talk about post-Christian society, but that's really not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a post-Protestant society. And in Protestant circles, it's very clear that there are two genders, and not only are there two genders, but there's two gender roles. Men do this, women do this. Men, marry women and provide for families. Women marry men and they make babies. That's what men and women do. When I was a Protestant, that was clearly taught. The high calling of the Christian life is for a man to be a father and a husband, and for a woman to be a wife and a mother. And if you're a single Protestant, you're basically doing everything in your power to find a spouse. They've got single retreats and conferences and all kinds of activities to try to help kids meet spouses, and all the pressure is on young men and women to get married because that's what Protestants do. That's how the faith is practiced by Protestants. It all has to do with marriage, and that's because at the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant Reformation wanted nothing to do with celibacy or religious vocations. King Henry VIII, shut down all the monasteries, repossessed all of the monastery and convent lands in England, and just ended religious life in Protestant England in the 1530s, around there. So ever since the Protestant Reformation, we've had this binary view of gender pushed in Western society that is an oversimplification of the reality of what we should actually expect to find in modern society. Catholicism introduces much more complexity than this oversimplified Protestant view of the sexes and gender roles and things like that. And so we have to distinguish between biological sex and a person's identity, because these things aren't so simple. And let me just explain what I mean. Let's take our Lord. Our Lord was an unmarried celibate man. So he didn't marry, he didn't have any children, he wasn't a father, he wasn't a husband, humanly speaking. He was none of those things. So if we were to go to the Protestants and ask, is Jesus a man? Is Jesus a man? He's not married. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have children. Is he a man? And I don't think any Protestant would be crazy enough to say no, that Jesus is not a man. But if we separate their sort of self-contradicting talk about Jesus and look at how they talk about their peers, I think they would have a difficult time accepting a man like Jesus if they had to live around him. Just like they have a hard time accepting monks and nuns and priests and other celibate Catholics. They have a very difficult time processing what a person is who's not interested in getting married and having kids. I had a discussion one time with a Jew that was very similar. There was a Jewish rabbi who I used to debate with, and one day on one of my social media accounts, I just shared a picture. I shared a picture of some Benedictine monks, and I wasn't thinking about him or any of these issues. I just had a cool picture that I wanted to share of some Benedictine monks, and I posted it. And this Jewish man commented on the picture. It was just a picture of 4 or 5, I think they were Benedictine monks, just walking down this sort of cobblestone road somewhere in Europe. And he said, "What a waste! What a waste!" This idea of celibate men, this Jewish rabbi sees it as a waste of manhood to devote themselves to religious life. And that's the Jewish perspective, and unsurprisingly, it's also the Protestant perspective. What a waste. What a waste of a life to not start a family, which is the high calling of the Christian life. And Catholicism doesn't teach that. So Catholicism makes things more complicated than that. We look at our Lord, we find a man who doesn't marry, doesn't have children, and devotes his life to religion. It's almost an angelic life, except that he dwells in the flesh. But he doesn't physically reproduce. He devotes all of his attention to his spiritual life and his spiritual apostolate or ministry while he lives, and he encourages others to do the same. In his preaching, he says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Do not seek the things the Gentiles seek." He tells his disciples that there are some who are made eunuchs by men. There are others who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. He encourages men to imitate him in that focused, undistracted spiritual life. St. Paul, who actually does imitate him in that life, teaches the same thing. He explains how it's his desire, St. Paul's desire, that men and women not marry, but that they devote themselves exclusively to Christ, that they not entangle themselves with temporal concerns or with physical desires. He says, "Make no provision for the lusts of the flesh." He says, "I buffet my body and make it my slave." He doesn't have this idea of indulging bodily desires by seeking out romantic relationships and getting married. That's the teaching of St. Paul. So we have this Christian message, the life of Christ and a number of the prophets of the Old Testament. John the Baptist, another example of this celibate religious life. And then we have the Virgin Mary, who is the most I say this reverently, but the oddest of all. She's a virgin mother, which is as bizarre as a life can get. And then we've got Saint Joseph, who is a celibate married man, and we have this notion of conjugal chastity, which develops in Christian culture. St. Augustine talks about it, if you're interested in looking that up. If you look up that phrase, conjugal chastity, you'll see it's something that St. Augustine talks about. And then we've got this whole tradition of monastic life, of monks and nuns who live celibate lives devoted to Christ without any worldly distractions or family ties. So my point is that in Catholicism, we don't have this simple male-female division that we have in Protestant circles, because there's a distinction in the Catholic life. There's a distinction between biological sex being male and female, and this idea of gender being related to marriage and reproduction or sexuality, because there's a whole class of Catholic people that have no sexuality, that they are not homosexual, they are not heterosexual, they are asexual, they are celibate, and they are celibate for the sake of the kingdom of God. And so I just want to warn Catholics to avoid hopping on the Protestant side of things and just spewing all of this overly simplified men are fathers and husbands, women are wives and mothers, and anybody who says likewise is just some crazy liberal scum. Catholicism creates some of this confusion. It's very bizarre to think about how Catholicism, how Christ introduced this common celibate life, which really didn't have much of a place in the ancient world, though there were some celibates even among secular philosophers. And as I said, among the Jewish prophets there were some. John the Baptist was the last of the prophets. He was an unmarried celibate man. But Christ normalized that and called men and encouraged men, invited men to take up the same mode of life. And then, of course, we know that the same was practiced by women from the earliest days of the church. So in Catholic circles, we've got a number of different situations. We've got biological sex, which is black and white, male and female. But then we've got this notion of gender and sexuality that is a little more complicated, because it's not necessarily connected to sex and reproduction. And so it does present some complexity, I think. So if we think about this, we've got boys and girls, male and female, biologically, growing up in a society where they're being taught from this Protestant perspective that there's sort of like a two-lane highway. You're male or female. And if you're male, you're supposed to do this. And if you're female, you're supposed to do this. And it's not surprising for us to see a large number of boys and girls, men and women, looking at that message and saying, I don't feel like I fit into that model. I don't feel that I'm one of those two. I may be a biological female, but I don't feel like my lane is marriage and reproduction. I don't feel any interest or inducement to that life. And there are many biological males who look at that life of marriage and fatherhood and say, I'm not interested in that life. That's not the life that I desire. And so they're left with this uncertainty about what's going on inside of them. And they obviously, the more that is pushed and pushed and pushed as normal, the more they feel that there must be something weird about them. There must be something wrong. They must not be normal, or that must be just some kind of biased, false worldview that's being forced upon them or pushed upon them. And so there's going to be resistance to it, because the children and not necessarily children, but there are many in our society who look at that simple presentation of male role, female role, and they say, I really don't feel that I'm wired for that kind of a life. And so when that's presented as the only option, well, they have a couple of choices. They can just identify as being a weirdo, as many do, think something's wrong with them, that they're weird, or they can think that that system is false, and not knowing a true alternative to it, because it is false, it's overly simplified. Not knowing a true alternative, they turn to the other side and look and say, hey, can anybody help me figure out what's going on inside of myself? Because I look over here at the Christian right, and I see their message. I see all the women wearing dresses, carrying babies, and all the men in jackets and ties talking about, mortgages and insurance and paying for their family's health care. And I don't see myself being interested in that life. Can anybody over here on the left explain to me what's going on, or am I crazy or something weird? And so what happens? They start listening, and they get all of this weirdness from the opposite extreme. Oh, you're not interested in that life? Well, that's because you're probably gay. Maybe you're probably homosexual, and that's what you're feeling. So God made you a homosexual, and this is what they start to hear. God made you a homosexual. And that's why when you look at that message, you say, oh, that's not me, because that's heterosexual and you're homosexual. Well, if that's the alternative message, the kids begin to think that must be true, because I really don't feel like I fit in that life. For example, my wife and I met when we were 17 years old. When I grew up, I never could imagine not growing up and getting married. My wife was the same way. When she played as a kid, she thought about being a wife and mother and having children. We met when we were 17. As soon as we met, we wanted to get married. We knew we wanted to be together, and we wanted to get... I can't even imagine thinking about life outside of that married perspective. And so for me, I'm going to have a hard time understanding what someone else thinks or feels or experiences, because I simply don't share that. But just by reading, if we even reading the scriptures, we can see that it's not that simple. What I feel as a man who was drawn to married life, what my wife feels as a woman who was drawn to married life, is obviously not felt by everyone. Christ didn't have this desire for marriage. St. Paul didn't have this desire. John the Baptist didn't have this desire for marriage. We know that a multitude of saints never had this interest in marriage or family life. And so to pretend that anyone who doesn't feel the way I feel is sinful is just craziness, because obviously most of the saints didn't feel the way I feel. And yet we're championing this overly simplified male and female message because we're just running with the Protestants in this political zeal, blinded to the reality of what's being discussed here. And what's happening is, by jumping on board with this false, oversimplified position, we're leaving these people who are questioning and confused subject to learning from the crazies on the other side. And that's what's happening in most cases, because Catholicism has been rooted out of Western civilization ever since the Protestant Reformation and also the Scientific Revolution. And so anyone who doesn't feel this Protestant attraction to married life is just branded as some kind of weirdo, some kind of deviant. And the crazy, the crazy reprobates on the other extreme, they're just going to tell everyone that they're homosexual or LGBTQ, transgender. Now they're going to just be introducing them to these ideas, and because the kids see only this one other alternative and they know that that's not true, now they're open to listening to all of this other stuff. And I would argue that they're not necessarily really interested in this other stuff. It's just the only alternative that's being presented to them, because this Protestant male-female married life message is just so dominant from the right side that they feel like if they don't fit into that, then they have to look to this, morally liberal left-hand side. And it's unfortunate, because I think Catholicism comes far left from that right extreme message and has a lot more to say about these things. And so we come to the question of celibacy and religious life. And again, this is affected by Protestantism, because even Catholics think in terms of Protestant teaching. There's all this weirdness. If you've ever seen a religious movie, a Christian movie, where modern filmmakers try to show a life of the prophets or the apostles or of Christ or of a saint or something, anytime there's some sort of miracle or spiritual event, it gets very awkward and goofy, because we've got this Protestantish idea of the spiritual life, which makes anything talking about the Holy Spirit or miraculous power, it turns it into this bizarre, weird Protestant vision of the spiritual life, which is disconnected from real Catholicism. And so we're used to this kind of awkward, weird religious imagery. And so when we look at monks and nuns and priests in the modern Protestant-influenced American mind, we tend to look at these things with this mysterious sort of awkward confusion as to what they are. So when we talk about religious vocations, we talk about religious vocations, but we talk about them with Protestant ideas. We'll say things like, well, if God's calling you to this, then this will all happen, and these things will line up, and you'll know for certain that this is what God wants you to do, and you just have to sort of put the sails up and pray and see where God blows you, and if God blows you into a religious community or into a seminary, well then, and he keeps blowing you in that direction, and the wind never stops, and you just keep getting blown and blown into that. Well, that's how you discern your vocation, and that's just crazy Protestant goofiness, because that's got nothing to do with religious vocation. There was a Dominican who wrote a book called Religious Vocations, and it's something like an unnecessary mystery, something like that. I forget the author's name, but he was a Dominican. He wrote a book on how in modern society we've turned this talk about discerning religious vocations into this weird mystery that no one can be sure about. And to provide an alternative, I suggest a quote from Saint Teresa of Avila. Saint Teresa of Avila, she was zealous spiritually, and she looked at religious life and she said, I just can't get myself to desire it. I don't feel attracted to it. I don't desire it. I'm averse to this idea of a religious vocation. But she said this, and I'm paraphrasing, so you can find her exact quote. But she said, I know that religious life is good. Therefore, I'm going to force myself into it. And you can imagine if some 19-year-old girl said that today, she'd be immediately discouraged and told that she's thinking about this all wrong. And yet those are the exact sentiments of one of the most famous spiritual women in the history of the church. And again, this is why I think there's a lot of confusion about religious vocations today that's influenced by this sort of wacky Protestant Pentecostal idea of spiritual things. And so we've got kids living in the flesh who are thinking things, feeling things, drawn to things, averse to things, and they're being told that, well, that really has nothing to do with vocation. All that matters is you have to sort of discern your destiny and figure out, like, in God's secret book, what occupation or vocation He has chosen for you, and you need to sort of figure that out by just listening to the Spirit. Let the Spirit guide you. Let the Spirit, and it's all of this vague, confusing, uncertain advice that the kids receive. And it's no surprise that we have no interest in religious vocations, because not even the Catholics seem to understand what religious vocations are. Let's just think about that for a minute. A religious vocation, a vocation first of all, and I've talked about this before, a vocation is simply a calling. And so we have to ask, okay, well, if it's a calling, where does this call come from? Where does this call come from? Does an angel approach me one day like Gabriel approached the Virgin Mary? Is that what a calling looks like? Well, in Mary's case, yes, that's what her calling looked like. So what exactly does this calling look like? Am I going to get, a voice in my head talking to me? Is an angel going to appear to me? Am I going to be driving down the road one day and all of a sudden there's going to be a billboard that tells me what I should do? How do I discern this calling? And it's this sort of present, I think the word that's used is this sort of immanence, where it's just like me in this sort of, absorbed into this spiritual world where God is moving me and speaking to me inaudibly, telepathically, and I'm supposed to pay attention and discern all these little different signs and it's this miserable message that suggests that this calling, which is the most important thing in our life, is subject to this sort of discernment of what's going on in this invisible, inaudible, indirect messaging system that exists between God and men. That's the calling. That's where we're supposed to discern it. So you need to sort of find a place to go sit on a cliff somewhere and just stare off into the horizon and try to discern your call. And it's just this goofy wackiness that I think has its origins in Protestant counterfeit spirituality that has confused Catholic young men and women when we talk about these things. So where does the vocation actually come from? My answer would be that this vocation to religious life is a general call, a general invitation made to all Christians by Christ himself. I would say that this vocation is not something that's private or secret, that needs to be discovered by some sort of, secret spiritual decoder ring that you use to interpret all of these bizarre omens that surround you every day. I would argue that the vocation to religious life, the vocation to celibacy for the kingdom of heaven, is a general call, a general invitation that Christ has already made to all Christians. He's already made this call to any Christians. And this can be proven in the Gospels. When Christ teaches about Christian marriage and explains to his disciples that Christians cannot divorce and remarry, that what God has joined together, men may not put asunder, to use the old language, or break. Jesus explains the binding nature of Christian marriage as he, establishes the sacrament of matrimony. He's explaining this to his disciples, and his disciples respond with a question, or I should say with an objection. They say, if this is true, then it is better for a man not to marry. And we just take that phrase, it is better for a man not to marry. That's what the disciples say to Jesus after Jesus finishes teaching on Christian marriage. They say, if this is true, then it is better for a man not to marry. And Jesus says, whoever can accept it, let him accept it. And he says that in the context of his teaching on men making themselves eunuchs, to use a figure of speech, making themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And so we have this general invitation, or even recommendation of celibate religious life that Christ makes to any who will follow him. He basically invites any Christian. He encourages any Christian to seek that life because, like St. Teresa of Avila, objectively speaking, it's better, and it's the safest and straightest path to holiness, which is the goal of the Christian life. So I would argue that this general call to follow Christ in his celibate life has been, sort of ripped out of the Christian conscience by Protestantism. And Catholics in the 21st century, being so heavily influenced by Protestantism, have learned to think about the life of Christ and to think about church history from a Protestant perspective, a perspective that doesn't even comprehend the lives and the choices of Christ and of all the saints that we learn about who chose religious life. And if you go and read the biographies of saints, you'll see that they don't think about religious life and religious vocations the way that modern people talk about them, the way that modern Catholic college students talk about them, and so on. They think about them based on, like I said, the invitation to seek first the kingdom of God in the Gospels. They understand that it's a general invitation, and they understand that it's an objective, rational invitation to choose a superior mode of life as a Christian. Now, that way of thinking about religious vocation as kids are growing up has been largely lost. And so anything in these kids that isn't drawn to married life gets interpreted as some kind of bizarre deviance from what's normal or natural, and it's simply not true. I would actually argue that it's good. It's a good thing for especially Christian kids to be growing up and really not be zealous for married life, not be attracted to married life, because again, you see how we just open more and more cans of worms as we talk about this. All of the marriage counseling that's been developed to try to sell marriage to as many people as possible, it's relied on a dishonest romanticizing of marriage that most kids growing up in families know isn't true. They see their parents struggling. They see their parents arguing. They see the difficulties of married life. Unfortunately, many of them see divorces and adulteries and all kinds of problems in married life, and they don't have this silly romanticized view of what marriage is really like. And so growing up in the presence of real married people, they say to themselves, I really don't want to be like mom when I'm an adult. I really don't want to be like dad when I'm an adult. And so they have this, what I think is a natural aversion to married life, because I think married life, again, in Christian circles, it says, well, that's sort of the default I don't agree with that. I think marriage is special. If you think about what's required to have a good marriage, how can anyone pretend that that's common, something that we should just sort of expect to be present in our lives? I don't think God himself teaches that in the scriptures. We read, for example, in the Proverbs, that a God-fearing wife, we're told, is a gift. A prudent wife is from the Lord. In other words, you don't just go online to prudentwife.com and grab yourself one of these millions of prudent, God-fearing women out there who are ready to be Christian wives and mothers. These women are like unicorns in the world. And same thing is true for women. If you're a 20-year-old Christian young woman, you don't just go on Amazon and order yourself some God-fearing, devout, loving man who wants to spend his life working to provide for a wife and children. These ideal partners are, like I said, they're like unicorns in the world. You can't just go get one. And so I think that marriage is dishonored by this sort of common attitude towards it, that you just decide you want to get married and go to youth group and expect to find some girl there that's going to be a great. I just don't think that that's realistic. I don't think that respects just how special Christian marriage is. And like I said, when the disciples heard Jesus' talk on married life, they said, man, it's better for a man not to get married. They say the opposite of this goofy, Pride and Prejudice view of married life and romantic marriages and things like that. Again, I think it's Catholics being influenced by non-Catholic or even anti-Catholic sources that think like this, and they just borrow all of this Protestantish marriage counseling stuff to try to promote marriage as a way of indulging all of your sexual desires as you sit as an idle college student with nothing to do, being told that you just need to be celibate forever until you finish your PhD, and they're pushing marriage on these kids to try to prevent them from any scandalous fornication or sins. It's really not concerned with the real purpose and Christian teaching on marriage at all. It's just sort of reacting to this artificial college cultural train wreck that we've created that leaves kids from 18 to 20 plus left to try to live a celibate life in secular society, which is, again, insulting to religious life, because the monastic life and the discipline of the monastic life, which is necessary for this Christian celibacy, is just sort of written off as unnecessary. We don't need that stuff. We can just go out to the world and live in a co-ed dorm with a bunch of unbelievers and be it's such an irresponsible and unrealistic culture that we've created that we have to react to it by some Protestantish zeal for getting kids married, even when that's really not what these kids are feeling or thinking or should be taught, and so on. So again, it's wheels within wheels with the problems that develop in this modern society. But anyway, my point here is that this men and women get married and have kids message and say, like, that's Christianity. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's the truth. And anything other than that is some kind of crazy, liberal, left-wing, LGBTQ crazy. That's simply not true. Catholicism is more complicated than that. So we may have young people looking at married life and say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be like mom. I don't want to be like dad. I don't want to have to do what dad does. I don't want to do what mom does. And again, I think moms and dads often take for granted the grace that they have that makes them willing to do those things. I work to provide for a family of 12, and I'm aware that my delight in working and providing for my family is not natural. It's the fruit of God's grace in my life, and I don't take that for granted. When I talk to my kids, I don't just assume that desire is present in them, because I know that it's unique. It's the fruit of my own Christian life. It's the result of God's grace, and my wife's willingness to be a loving wife and sacrificial mother, to give herself so generously and freely to her family. That's not normal. It's not normal for a woman to want to do that. So if I talk to my daughters, I don't expect to find in them all of this faith, hope, and charity that I find in my wife. It's grace that made my wife what she is. I don't take that for granted when I talk to my kids. And so if we look through their perspective and don't just presume that grace that we have received is present in everyone else. And think about what they're actually thinking and experiencing and feeling and so on. And consider whether or not they may be sending signs that they're not interested in married life, and that that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that could be a good thing, but because the teaching on religious vocations and things like is so goofy and awkward that the kids just aren't interested in it. And I've experienced this myself. My oldest kids, especially my oldest two, they were open to religious vocations, and I feel like when the time came to start talking to vocations directors or priests and people, I felt like they became confused about it, and it became awkward and weird, and they just sort of took a left-hand turn. My son decided to go into the military. My daughter decided to also go into the military for medical work. But they were there. They were there asking the right questions, open to things, and the message from the clergy, from the church to them was just sort of bizarre and awkward, and they just felt uncomfortable with it. And like I said, they hung a left at that crucial juncture of their life. And I saw the confused teaching about discerning a vocation as an actual discouragement of any interest in religious life for kids who were open to it and raised with an understanding of the spiritual life. But anyway, my point is that I think that some of this gender confusion is a good thing. It's a natural thing. It's what Christ came into the world to teach. Christ showed us that life is not just about marriage and reproduction, but there's much more to be interested in. There's much more exciting, interesting, humanly gratifying things to pursue in life than married family life. And the fact that our kids are not attracted to that doesn't mean that they're all gay and transgender crazies. It just means that there's something in them that's turning them away from married life. And for most of them, I think that the direction that they should be pointed towards is religious life. But again, there's so much misinformation, so much awkward, discouraging communication. Many of the religious communities are not inviting, they're not welcoming, they're not generous in explaining their charisms or the work that they do to other people. They just sort of live locked away and mind their own business. They don't meet these so-called discerning Catholics where they're at and help them out. And I think young Catholic adults who have an interest in something beyond married life, something freer and more, I would say, happier than married life, are not met by the clergy, by the religious, with the information and the help that they need to pursue those interests, which are objectively better. I mean, just imagine if a girl talked to Teresa of Avila and got that kind of a message where religious life is objectively superior and better, so you should pursue it for the sake of your soul. Imagine, these young Catholic girls sitting with a woman like Teresa of Avila and talking about religious vocations, or talking to Padre Pio or, St. Augustine or St. Benedict talk about these things, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Francis. What would happen if an 18-year-old Catholic boy told St. Francis that he doesn't want to get married and he's interested in doing something more meaningful with his life? And what do you think St. Francis would have said to him? You think St. Francis would have said, you need to be safe, you need to go to college and get your degree, you need to make sure that you're prudent, you need to make sure you don't... St. Francis sacrificed everything as a young man, stripped naked in the middle of his town, and chose to devote himself to God in a vocation that no one even understood at the time. Just imagine if these kids were counseled by some of these saints. You can imagine that they'd get very different responses. And it's no surprise that these saints inspired so many to follow them into religious life. But that message is simply not what children receive today. Those who do, I would argue that if we find Catholic kids who are inspired to religious life, I guarantee that almost all of them are inspired because they're reading the lives of the saints and they're getting that message from the saints and they know that it's true. Or they happen to be in touch with some unique, I wouldn't even say religious, but some unique priest who inspires them in that way and encourages them in that way. Has that sort of old world view of religious vocations, and then directs them. And also, let's just keep going with this, because even the thought of religious vocations for many kids growing up in Catholic families, it means becoming a priest. And a kid will look at that and say, like, I really am not interested in being a priest. And they'll think that that's what celibacy means, that celibacy is sort of united to the priesthood and to the priestly ministry. And they may have different interests and desires that really aren't fulfilled through the priestly ministry. And so they may say, never mind, I don't think I'm interested in religious life. And they don't understand that the nature of religious life has so many different manifestations, so many different personalities, I guess I could say. As we look at the different religious orders, Franciscans and Dominicans are totally different. Jesuits and Carmelites and Benedictines, the religious communities all have a different personality. And so there's room for not only a life that's not directed towards married life or family life. There's also all kinds of diversity available within religious life that, again, I don't think most kids are being introduced to. I don't think they understand the nature of religious life, or they think of it in a romanticized, sort of overly spiritualized, weird way that makes them feel uncomfortable. And it's unfortunate because I think many of them are open to something more sublime than married family life, and we're not showing them the options that are available. And so then, seeing that they're just weirdos who don't want to get married, they then start to listen to the crazies on the other side, and they start being told to consider whether they might be gay, or whether they might be this or that, or maybe maybe they don't even know what gender they are. And I think they're listening to these things because there doesn't seem to be an explanation for what's going on in their heads and in their hearts as they enter into young adulthood. And that confusion and deception and misleading information is real. It's a real temptation, a real source of deception and error in their lives. And so what do we do as the far right? We just attack them and shun them and banish them from the household because they're embarrassing us, because they're now into these things and they're trying to look like their friends from this community and they've got this interest in that and they're talking about. I think that this is not as clear-cut an issue of rebellion as it's presented as being. I think a lot of it is just youthful ignorance. I think a lot of it is just the sort of natural aversion to the authority of parents, which is just part of becoming an adult. I think a lot of it should be ignored. I think a lot of it is reacted to too zealously by parents, and the sort of little whimpering fire that's in the kid's life is sort of fanned into this giant inferno that consumes everything because parents overreact to it. And I've talked about that in other talks, where I think parents are often motivated by pride and worry about what other people think outside the family, and that actually leads them to react to their kids' temptations and troubles in a selfish way that just sort of pushes the kids even further down that path. And I think that's what we're dealing with this stuff. I think that's what we're dealing with. I think we're making more of this than we really should. We're not thinking about it as clearly and reasonably as we should. We're not acknowledging just how poorly our generation communicates Catholicism to our kids. We're struggling to figure it out ourselves. We've got all kinds of confusion to work through. I know that's true in my life. There's so many things that I've had to learn through my own study and private, investigation, as it were, trying to figure things out that I'm certainly not going to learn them from the parish or from, Catholics I run into day by day. I've got to seek these things out and study. I'm still trying to figure things out myself. So to pretend that our kids should have it all figured out and know how to think about everything is just dishonest, because we know how complicated it is. We know how difficult it is to get to good teaching, and these kids aren't getting good teaching. You can say, well, we taught them the catechism, but did you address these issues? I would bet you didn't address these issues. And so we have to be patient. I think that's the most important thing. So let's just get back to the subject of this gender question, all right? Is it possible that we're presenting our kids with an overly simplified binary view of life that goes beyond questions of sexuality and gets into gender roles and makes them binary as well, which is false teaching? All right, let me explain that a little clearer. I said before that it's obvious that naturally our sex physically or biologically is male and female. So that's simple, right? Male and female biological sex of different people. But when we get to gender and gender roles, if we think a little more broadly about what it means to be a man or to be a woman, there isn't such a simple black and white definition anymore, because getting married and reproducing isn't necessarily what makes a person a man, and bearing children isn't necessarily what makes a person a woman. So you can have a girl who doesn't want to be a wife and mother. Is she a woman? Your definition of woman has to include a celibate life. It can't be limited by, persons who reproduce and who bear children. They're women, and men who produce children. They're men. It's got to also include celibates. And so the view of a male and female has to be broader than just husband and wife or father and mother. And I don't think that that's often communicated to kids enough. I think we spend so much time pounding married morals down their throats that we don't realize that they're not necessarily interested in or called to married life. And that leaves them wondering what the purpose of their life is. And our definition of male and female has to be broader than husband and wife, father and mother. It has to include religious as well. And maybe we're not communicating that very clearly. Maybe we're not teaching that broader view of life. And I know the church teaches that. I know the catechism teaches that. But maybe we're presenting them with too much of a Protestant view of vocation and future life, too concerned about finding them Catholic spouses without realizing they don't even need to get married, and presenting them with really only part of the picture of the Christian life. So I think that's a big part of the problem. And it leaves them vulnerable to have other people interpret their thoughts and feelings. And sometimes I think that what these other people say will make more sense to them than what their parents or their priest or whoever else, teachers, are saying to them. I think that what the world says may actually be more reasonable and sensible to them than what they hear from the Catholics in their lives. And then what are we going to say? Are we going to blame the kids in those situations because the message from the crazies actually makes more sense to them? If we leave our kids in that situation, then I don't really know how we can beat the kids up for following the path that seems to be clearer. So I think we have to be realistic about the situation that we've put our kids in, where, like I said, when we do talk about religious vocations, it's surrounded with all of this confusing, mystical weirdness that that I cringe at when I hear it. I'm discerning, and like, discerning what? What are you discerning? Like, religious life is an objective issue. Like, the celibate life for the kingdom of heaven is superior. It's the better mode of life. And if you can, you should choose it. And if you can't, well, then there's got to be a reason why you can't. And it's most likely that you don't have the virtue or the self-control to pursue it. And therefore, marriage is necessary for you to avoid fornication. Like, I mean, it's not a complicated conversation to have. And yet, I think that, again, it's so dominated by the Protestant far-right, focus on the family message, pro-life movement, have kids, get married, have babies, that's God's way. That message is so strong that anyone who doesn't feel drawn to marriage and family life is left to the world to try to figure out what the alternatives are. And the alternatives are craziness, and that's partly our fault. It's certainly not church teaching that many of us are giving the kids about the opportunities that they have in life, about the lifestyle that they are free to live and called to live by Christ himself. We don't teach these things well. There's all kinds of confusion, discouragement, misinformation, and there are consequences. That's why I said it's important for us to realize that all of this talk about this gender confusion is taking place in the midst of a generation where there are no religious vocations. I think that's sort of a sign as to what the problem may be, that our failure to explain the religious vocation clearly and effectively may be what leaves these kids vulnerable to this interpretation of their lack of interest in married life that opens them to all of this craziness. And that's really my argument here for what's going on. I think we've really failed our kids. We've failed to teach them the faith clearly. We failed to teach them about religious vocations. We get so caught up in our own married life, and it's there's nothing we can do about that. It's we're busy, and I have to work to provide for a family. My wife is working to take care of the children and to do her own tasks every day. It's hard to get to all these things, but there's a lack of formation with regard to the options for Catholic children. They're often overly simplified. They're often misrepresented. They become sort of, you're either called to be Padre Pio or get out of here, or you're either called to be Saint Francis, reborn, or get out of here. And many they see themselves as sinners with all kinds of weaknesses and problems, and rather than religious vocation being a support and a help for that weakness, they're made to think that it's like getting into an Ivy League school. And if you're not already strong and holy, if you're not already as wise as St. Dominic or as humble as St. Francis, then you really have no place in religious life. And we've got the whole thing turned upside down. And I think that's the root issue that's at work here. I think that there are so many kids raised with just a lack of clarity about their about who they are, what they are, and what their options are, that they're left vulnerable to this interpretation of their abnormal feelings. And much of what they hear from the crazies makes more sense than what they hear from the Christians. So I don't think that these gender issues are as serious as many think. I think that even when kids are badly formed, badly taught, influenced by false sources and things I think it's just a matter of time before the kids figure that out, and these things come and go. That's why, today the hippies from the 70s are accountants, and school teachers. They don't stay hippies forever. If something is not true, it's not sustainable. And so I think you have to encourage ourselves to realize that this is heavily connected to just that normal phase of life where kids try to figure out who they are, and unfortunately they don't have many good sources explaining to them what they need explained, and so they're listening to all of this goofiness. And then we've got the whole craziness with the internet and the smartphones and social media, and there's just lots of influence in our kids' minds that we're not going to keep it all out. And those who try to keep it all out, they're going to set themselves up even for a greater fall, because the kids are just going to feel like cornered serpents, whose only option is to break out and run away. That's not going to solve things. We just have to realize that our kids face real challenges. We have to be educated enough and smart enough to really understand these issues so that we can talk about them intelligently. And we have to find ways to present our kids with all the information so that they can be well informed and understand that just because they don't want to settle into this blue male and pink female view of their adult life, that there's not something wrong with them. But there are other options within God's will for them to consider. And I don't think we've communicated that very well to them. So, yes, it can lead into all kinds of sins, and I know that's distressing to parents to think that, a child identifies as gay. Now what does that mean? Who is he with? What are they doing? There's all kinds of dangers, none of which, aren't explained in the parable of the prodigal son. So it's not something crazy that we're experiencing. We may deal with some different, currents of thought in our generation, but it's nothing that the scriptures haven't already explained to us. And many of us are going to have to pray and continue to love and evangelize our kids until they've gathered enough experience in the world down bad paths that they finally become convinced that this idea of rebelling is a bad idea, and they come back ready to turn to God with more understanding, with more of their own experience and lesson that allows them to even go beyond what their parents may be able to communicate to them, and they come back having sinned much and are forgiven. And like Jesus says, those who have been forgiven much are those who love much. They become some of the greatest saints, those who return from wayward paths. So I think we have to keep an open mind and a positive, optimistic spirit. We have to try to fix whatever problems we can fix. We have to pray for the kids and sacrifice for the kids, and pray that God leads them to conversion and directs them through all of these confusing things. Do everything we can to communicate clearly with them about these things, provide them with good resources to help them, and so on. But understand that it's just, we live in a toxic generation, and there are going to be negative effects of that generation, and we've got to trust that God's grace is sufficient to overcome them. And just be faithful witnesses to the Catholic life. Be faithful in defending the faith, in explaining Christian teaching, in studying to have an answer for complicated modern issues, not to just be the ignorant political right, just barking all of the banner slogans. That doesn't work. It's more complicated than that. And we need to have a more mature faith, a modernized faith that goes beyond old questions and issues and addresses modern questions and issues, because there are very few Catholics who can do that. So I hope that's helpful. I know we still have this crazy, growing transgender gender identification crisis to deal with, but I think we have to realize what the nature of this is, and that it's not some crazy thing that's going on. It's just confusion, and it's immaturity in our kids. It's the influence of the world, and we've got to keep them safe. We've got to keep them focused, keep them working, keep them moving forward in their lives, love them, be patient with them, pray for them, forgive them, help them, make sure that they know that they're welcome home like the prodigal son was, and not shun them or make them feel that their chance is over, and they're just abandoned by God and might as well just turn and run with their crowd. We have to avoid that. So it just brings us back to living a faithful Christian life, which is our duty no matter what. So we've got to amend our lives, keep studying, keep learning, keep praying, and try to give them the best example and model of a true Christian life, and hope that as they go through these experiences, they'll learn the hard way what's counterfeit and what's true, and that in the end, like St. Augustine came back to his mother Monica, they'll come back to their senses, having learned the hard way, but also learning maybe the most permanent way, that God's way is the truth, and there's no counsel against the Lord, which is our goal for them. So that's what I have to say about this gender stuff. I think it's not as serious as many Christians make it to appear. I think that much of the attraction and influence of it is our fault, and we can fix that. I don't think it's some big sweeping, tsunami of spiritual ruin. I think, we stink at our job as parents and teachers. We're doing a bad job. The clergy's doing a bad job communicating. The religious communities do a bad job at communicating. And what we see in our kids is the result of all that. We've just got to keep working and try to get better, and make sure the next month, the next year are better than the last one. And that's all that we have the power to do, is to try to be faithful in what's in our control, and trust that if we are, that good things will come of it. So don't be discouraged. Don't be overwhelmed by it. Don't make more of it than you should. Make sure you're not acting selfishly towards the kids. Don't cop out and just push them out of the house and send them away so you're not embarrassed. You have to persevere to the end and love your children. And it's a cross to bear, but that's what the Christian life is for. So if there's any aspect of that you'd like to think through or talk about in more detail, let me know. But I just tend to look at these things from an evangelistic perspective and not get all caught up in the craziness, because I don't think that it's as bad as it appears. I think that we've all gone through our youthful foolishness. We've all had our youthful sins. We've all struggled with youthful lusts. And, our kids are going to mature and grow up. I think the most important thing is they know that we love them. They continue to have the truth preached to them in loving and humble ways. And they know that they're always welcome with us, that they never are turned away. They'll always be received with love, with the prodigal son parable showing us how things work and what salvation looks like. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any other issues you'd like to discuss or get into, just let me know, because I'd like to pursue this issue more. And I appreciate questions and suggestions to sort of direct our discussions together and think through these things. So I hope that's helpful. God bless.